Hi, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone. Good day to all, and a warm welcome from the Asian Development Bank. My name is Ahmed Said. I'm Vice President for East Asia, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific here at the ADB. We're really privileged to have a great spotlight session today. Before we get to that, just some brief announcements. The session today is being recorded and will be available in the on-demand library. There is a Russian interpretation and captioning. Those who want to use these should click on the Interprefi link to open a new window. For captions of the session in English, select Source. For interpretation and captions in Russian, select Russian from the drop-down menu. We invite you to use the chat box to start the conversation and the Q&A to ask your questions. Today is day 3 of the ADB Gender Forum, and the topic of today's spotlight session is how can just transition be a force for gender transformative change? This is an important subject, and we're excited to have a conversation about it. And we're honored to have with us today Sharon Burrow, General Secretary of the International Trade Union Confederation, ITUC, joining us today. Welcome, Sharon. So great to have you with us. Sharon is the General Secretary of the ITUC, as I mentioned. She's held this position since 2014. Prior to that, she spent a decade as the president of the Australian Council of Trade Unions from 2000 until 2010. The ITUC is an extraordinarily important organization, the world's peak labor union body. It has grown to represent 207 million workers in 163 countries and territories with 331 national affiliates. Sharon is known well for much of her work, important amongst it, international advocacy on labor standards, corporate responsibility, climate change, investment in infrastructure and the green economy, investment in the care economy, women, equality and diversity, global migration, and employment, a very broad range of subjects on which she's made significant contributions. She also serves as a commissioner on the Global Commission on the Economy and Climate, a committee that she is joined on by ADB President Masa Asakawa, former New Zealand Prime Minister Helen Clark, and other world leaders. Today's session could not be more timely. The Paris Agreement on climate change includes just transition as an essential principle, as it in fact is and should be. We are currently embarking on one of the most critical transitions for our own survival and our planet. This is the transition, as we all know, to a net zero world. Just last month, ADB joined other multilateral development banks in issuing a joint statement outlining our commitment to 5 high-level principles for a just transition. The shared statement outlines how MDBs will support countries to move away from the use of fossil fuels and toward low greenhouse gas, GHG, emissions and climate resilience in a way that shares the costs and benefits while supporting and protecting communities, industries, and workers. MDBs also intend to support a just transition that aims to deliver climate objectives while enabling socioeconomic outcomes, including, importantly, on gender equality and SDG 5. The world has been through many transitions in the past, and we have an opportunity now to ensure that no one is left behind in the transition to a net zero and climate resilient future. We have an important responsibility to ensure that opportunities presented by a just transition, including ensuring that women benefit from the potential opportunities in the green economy. And we must, of course, ensure that these are maximized and result in benefits for both people and planet. Sharon, I know that over the years, you have led the discussion on just transition, and I know that you are working towards ensuring that this just transition brings about positive and lasting change in our world. Sharon, the floor is yours. Thank you so much again for joining us today.
Thank you very much, Ahmed, and indeed, it's a pleasure to be with you, and particularly in this context, as you so aptly described it. Let me just step back and say for working people, we've faced now a convergence of crisis. Even before COVID-19, we had historic levels of inequality. We already saw that progress for women had stalled in terms of women's participation, in terms of income, and indeed insecurity at work was increasing. We also knew, of course, that we couldn't just solve inequality alone because you had the climate emergency that required us to think about the intersection of these demands for a better future. And then, of course, COVID-19. And COVID-19 laid bare these fault lines in the global economy. It showed just how dependent we are on fundamental work that keeps us in survival mode, whether it's health, whether it's services. Indeed, the people who went to work every day to enable us to actually remain safe were, in fact, the majority of women, mostly low paid, often in unsafe or insecure work. So when you think about the environment we now find ourselves in, where the convergence of crisis requires us to rethink the way that our economies are shaped, structured, the exclusion that is in fact driving anger and despair that you just saw, morph into a total distrust in the chasm between even the good people inside the COP room, the climate conference room at Glasgow, and those outside, then we very, very, very urgently need the tools to bridge that gap, to try and rebuild trust. And that can only come from inclusion and from security. So as we build recovery from COVID-19, it has to be in that context of a convergence of crisis, but it also has to have at its heart people and planet. And if we're serious about ensuring inclusion, then we have to look to equality, not just of income, but indeed of gender and, of course, of race. But if you think about the increasing exclusion of women, what will it require? It will require a transformative agenda which is centered on a new gender inclusive social contract. The social contract started to break down in the 1980s with hyperglobalization. And what you saw there was indeed the product of today, beginning with a labour income share that's gone down like a roller coaster since the 1980s and still continues to dive. So people were already feeling despair about trying to make ends meet before COVID-19 hit. And today, what that looks like is a broken labour market. We have 60% of the world's workers, the majority of whom are women, in the informal economy. No rights, no minimum wage, no rule of law, no social protection in too many instances. That's not a recipe for inclusion. It's not a recipe for stable economies. And of course, when you add the 40% that have some kind of formal contract, a third of those are in increasingly precarious or insecure work. And our supply chains on which the global wealth has been built are too often simply a depiction of dehumanizing exploitation. So we need a new social contract, and it needs to be based on a set of very simple demands. Jobs, jobs, and jobs is number one. And of course, they must be climate friendly jobs with just transition. But if we need 575 million new jobs to reach full employment by 2030 to realise goal 8, the majority of those jobs have to, in fact, be for women. If we're going to catch up on gender participation, then those jobs have to be about recognition of the world of work for women. We also need to formalise our target, at least 1 billion informal jobs. And that's possible if we invest in minimum living wages, in indeed fundamental rights, and of course in universal social protection. So when you think about how do we get those jobs, where do they come from? Well, I can tell you that already there's about 80 million teachers who are required in the world today, just today, a deficit of 80 million teachers. It's about the same in terms of care workers. And when you think about the jobs in care, every investment that you put in to what is a resilience floor for any of those crises, whether it's climate, whether it's in fact an economic shock, or whether it's a personal shock or indeed a further health shock, you must have universal social protection. It's why the UN Secretary General has brought those two things together as part of a new social contract with the new Global Jobs and Social Protection Accelerator. So, if we're thinking about where jobs come from in terms of just transition, then they come from every sector. But if we're going to build a resilience floor, then let's begin with care, because there are good jobs there for women. But also, if we lift the burden of care off women, then they are free to participate in the broader economy. We all know the research. There's no doubt that the multiplier impact of equal participation of women is extraordinary. Women lost $900 billion during COVID-19 in combined income. That's about the aggregate GDP of 98 of the smaller countries. The statistics show that if, in fact, women were genuinely equal in our economies, you could add 13 trillion to the global economy, apart from the security of the lives of women and their families. If you think about Jyoti Ghosh's assertions earlier in the week in this forum, she actually described a 5R approach to address this challenge: recognising unpaid care work, reducing unpaid work, redistribute unpaid work in a mutually beneficial way, reward the care workers, and ensure that care workers have representation in a formalised labour market. That's a recipe for dealing with resilience. That and social protection will give us a floor of hope and trust in the world. But on top of that, it builds jobs. We know that it's affordable. We've done the research to show that social protection not only builds basic economy, but returns up to 1.9% on investment. But the extraordinary thing is, if women are free to work in the broader labour market, then as we make the energy transition, and we note, Ahmed, the ADB's energy transition mechanisms, we urge that workers be at the table with their unions, along with where we need to renew communities, community representatives, and that we recognise the role of the state in stabilising and driving energy transitions. I can tell you there are jobs in renewable energy. For every 20 jobs, there's 5 to 10 in supply chains. Indeed, if they're good jobs, with just wages, then there's 30 to 35 in the broader economy. That's how we build economies. And women already have more work, more jobs in renewable energy than they've ever had in fossil fuels, some 33% compared to around 20. So if you think about jobs with just transition, it's all about making sure that workers are at the table, that they have a say about the future, that the transparency and the trust is there. And we're seeing that in many areas, the transition of heavy industry, as well as I indicated, the building of care and energy futures. But we have some other demands in this social contract, because we also want to see rights, decent work, and mandated due diligence if we don't end the dehumanising exploitation of our supply chains. Then again, the majority of women suffer in low-paid, precarious, unsafe, short-term environments, and that's not a healthy recipe for any economy or any individual or their family. The ILO, and of course, we want to see minimum living wages and universal social protection. We can formalise informal work, as I said. If you want to see the recipe for these things, look at the ILO Centenary Declaration, negotiated between workers, employers, and indeed governments. And it has a prescription for jobs, irrespective of the employment contract, that says all workers should have fundamental rights, occupational health and safety, a minimum living wage, and we would add income, because we have to look at how we formalise through the intersection of income and social protection a minimum living wage equivalent for those people who aren't independent work. And of course, some control over hours of work. which is exploding again with new technologies, and often women again are trying to balance their lives with remote work, with family responsibility, and that's a disaster. We need to see, as I said, equality of incomes, yes, for women, but also equality in terms of participation and indeed equality across race, because the exclusion is intersectional. It comes down to social dialogue, women and their unions having a seat at the table so they can help prepare a future that's transparent, that has just transition plans, because every sector has to transition. It's not just energy, that's the foundations, but every sector. And as I indicated up front, you have to build a floor of resilience with care, healthcare, aged care, education, childcare. Those things are fundamental, along with, of course, women's participation in the broader economy. So I would simply say to you that equality and inclusion as a basis of economic reform is critical. And if we're not prepared to shift the parameters of our economy, then we will fail again. And the anger and the dislocation between communities, where we're seeing people withdraw into themselves, create distrust across global environments, but also within national environments, and the anger that's pouring out onto the streets because people absolutely feel that they have nowhere to turn. The good news is, on every indicator, women deliver. Education for women results in better paid job opportunities, higher health standards, and higher family incomes. Employment of women is one of the fastest multipliers of productivity. Mobility is increasing as migration has a majority female face, and we must do something about including with fundamental rights and guarantee of that centenary declaration migrant workers in this. And of course, women do twice as much unpaid care as men. And that unrecognised work not only keeps families and communities going, it contributes up to $10 billion to the economy in this current environment. So I would say to you, the economy, jobs, quality jobs, safe workplaces, women at the table with their unions, women have an understanding of what their community needs, and they contribute to the economy. Let's see them included in a way that stops the decline and the segregation of economic futures. I don't understand why we want to build wealth if we're not prepared to share it. So let's start now to think through how we put people, and that means women and men, in the context of an economic future that is just. One last thing is that unless we eliminate the violence against women in our workplaces, in our communities, then it makes it very hard for women to be equal participants. So Convention 190 of the ILO must be widely ratified, but it must also be at the heart of our planning around safe and secure work futures for women. Thank you. And I'm happy, of course, to answer questions, Ahmed.
Thank you so much, Sharon, for that clarion call to a better world. And you covered a lot of ground, and we have limited time, so I'm always struggling about where to begin. But I think your reminder that we have to formalize the informal. We have to grow the jobs we have. We have to ensure that they're more inclusive, particularly with respect to the role of women. And we have to extend the protections that are offered with these positions. I think that was a really powerful message. I think sometimes with things like with short amounts of time and big topics, it's important to talk about ideas, and because they animate so much of the things that happen at a practical level. And you also, you refer to the era. You refer to two things which I think are driven by ideas. One, you talked about the era of hyperglobalization, and some of the the legacy that it's left us, some of the negative legacy that it's left us. And you also talked about the lack of trust between those inside the room and outside the room at COP26. Institutions like the ADB have often been associated, with ideological underpinnings that have supported the push towards globalization. You didn't comment so directly on the kind of advice that we give countries, not at the practical policy level. I want to come to that in a minute, but in some of the assumptions that underlie the work we do. And I didn't want to shy away from that, Sharon. I wanted to put it on the table, and I wanted to hear from you. What do you think institutes like ours should be thinking about differently before we turn to what we should be doing differently?
Well, I think certainly your procurement power, the conditionality that you have that comes with funding and advice, these things are critical to actually bring together. And we've all depended on a failed economic model, whatever you want to call it, the Washington consensus, the trickle down theory, etc. And governments have been so dependent on doing whatever it takes from the private corporate lobby to get foreign direct investment that they've forgotten all too often that they're actually trying to build economies for their own citizens. And we gave up an economic security in terms of domestic demand all too often for the elusive export, sort of demand equation that was supposed to be the nirvana, particularly for countries in the Asia Pacific. It's not to say these things don't have a place, but the other element I would say is that all too often, and it's not related just to the ADB, this is a global orthodoxy. The conditionality that said reduce the role of the state, increase private power, privatization, then you've seen what's happening now with digitalization. You have monopoly power. Now, I grew up in an era where, as a union leader, we often railed against competition policy, but nevertheless, it was there for a reason. And now it's almost like that religion of 3 decades has disappeared in the face of corporate power that is simply based on a sheer profit-driven model that has no rights based all too often, that is not inclusive, that doesn't indeed think about again what its function is in terms of driving even basic demand, because a demand driven economy cannot exist. It just can't exist without people sharing prosperity. So whatever way you want to come at this, I would simply say we have to deal with climate. We're in a race against time, but we can't deal with it without inclusion of people and trust. And that's why we coined the phrase just transition. We need to be together working out what the solutions are. We need to listen to people about what kind of futures they want. And I would simply say multilateralism is incredibly important, your institution included, but it has to be more people-centered, and it has to take account of the damage done to people and the environment by the corporate model that we demonstrated. Now, of course, I readily admit that I work with corporations where they've got a right set of values every day, because workers' jobs are dependent on those corporations, and we believe in social dialogue. But there's too many companies who simply don't believe that people have a right to a voice, or indeed that they have fundamental rights. And we need your help to rectify this. The labour protocols that have been put in place are not perfect, but at the World Bank, through indeed the dialogue with the IMF, through the multilateral development banks, these are critical, and they must be robust, and they must be accountable against the ILO standards if we're to have a global floor that's fair competition for people and the environment.
Okay, thank you. We don't have that much time left, and I don't want to monopolize your time, so I'm going to share a question from the audience, and I'll just read it to you. According to the OECD, only 3% of climate finance has gender equality as a principal objective. What can we do differently to ensure that climate finance allocates the necessary resources to gender equality, including women's organizations that are woefully underfunded?
Well, they're two different questions at one level. I mean, the OECD statistics are absolutely correct, but it also goes to how much climate finance is in the areas that women are working on the front lines around. It could be adaptation as well as mitigation. It could be the informal economy where we're seeing the transformation of energy in agriculture, in services, in cooking, and so on. None of this is fast enough. And the fossil fuel subsidies that still exist are still actually, you know, a very tense discussion in parliaments around the world. They must be repurposed. And if they're not inclusive in terms of getting us those jobs, so if you take an example, then I'm really angry with our fossil fuel companies. They have the money, the assets, the technology, the skilled workforce. They could be transitioning so much faster. And if the fossil fuel subsidies were repurposed to say there's some conditionality with this, it's not about new exploration, it's about investing in renewables, it's about growing those jobs where women dominate as well across all of these industries, then we would see a massive difference. Funding women's organisations, it's always been a challenge to say, how does civil society fund itself? They're either at the behest of donors, or indeed you have, some contracts associated with investment. There is a need to sit down and say, if democratic organisations are part of the strength of democracies, and this is a very sensitive topic in our region. Of course, we have Myanmar, we have the increasing attacks and oppression in Hong Kong. We have unresolved issues in the Philippines where workers are at risk of extrajudicial killings. We've seen social dialogue break down in Indonesia. I could go on. We really need to say, if we're committed to democracy, and I don't know what else there is in our world, imperfect as it may be, then we have to look at how you include the voices of people. And what does that mean in terms of robust trade unions, civil society organisations, and how are they funded and how are they accountable to the people who depend on them?
Thank you, Sharon. And I really regret that we don't have more time with you, because I'd love to explore this and a number of other related subjects with you. Unfortunately, we've come to the end of our session. Thank you, Sharon. First of all, thank you for all that you do, and for being such a forceful advocate for change, and for being a voice for those who often are not given a voice, and for bringing your message to the ADB and to our gender forum. We're very grateful to you. We're going to move on now to the rest of the program. We have an excellent lineup of sessions to follow. In 30 minutes at 3 p.m. Manila time, we'll have a good practice session on the day's theme, Women as Agents of Change and Climate Action. And if I could ask those attending virtually to please don't forget to consider joining the small group Chai Chat conversations that are happening in between the formal agenda sessions to network with other participants. And also, please remember to check push notifications. That's a little bell icon on the upper right side of your screen to keep you up with all event notifications. Sharon, thank you so much. Thank you for being with us. Thank you to all of those who have attended, and a good day to everyone.